Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Book Club of California's online program titled Book Anatomy, Body Politics of Indigenous Book History. And thank you for joining us for this Book Club of California presentation. My name is Kevin Kosick, and I'm the Executive Director of the Book Club of California, and it's my pleasure to welcome you and host this webinar. For those of you that are new to the Book Club of California, the Book Club of California is a nonprofit, member and donor-supported organization that is dedicated to preserving and promoting the history of the book and the book arts. Oftentimes, we do that with a focus on the literature and the history of California and the West. Now, the Book Club publishes limited edition, finely made books, a scholarly journal, and keepsakes. We host a year-round series of exhibitions and programs like the one this evening on topics including fine printing, design, typography, bookbinding, collecting, California history, and much, much more. Now, if you're not a member of the book club, or if your membership has lapsed and you're interested in what we do, please consider joining our century-long tradition. Our membership dues are modest, but the benefits are many, and we simply can't do the work of the book club without the support of our members. So I encourage you to visit us online at bccbooks.org to join or to donate to the book club. Okay, and now for tonight's program and our presenter. The program is titled Book Anatomy, Body Politics of Indigenous Book History. And our presenter is Amy Gore. Now, Dr. Amy Gore is an assistant professor of English at North Dakota State University, where she specializes in early and 19th century American literature, book history and print culture, and Native American literature. She is a senior fellow in the Andrew W. Mellon Society of Fellows in Critical Bibliography, and her research has been supported by the National Endowment of the Humanities and the American Antiquarian Society. Her work appears or is forthcoming in several edited editions, and her articles appear in Studies in American Indian Literature, Pedagogy, and Western American Literature. The subject of her presentation this evening is her first book. I think it's your first book. Is that right, Amy?
That's right.
Great. It's her first book, Book Anatomy, Body Politics of Indigenous Book History. Now, Book Anatomy is published by the University of Massachusetts Press in 2023, and it theorizes the material relationships between books and bodies to claim the book itself as a form of embodied power relations between Native authors and the American publishing industry. Bringing Indigenous book history more firmly into conversations with mainstream narratives about the history of the book, her research claims books themselves as a source of embodied power for early Native American authors. Now, in terms of the logistics for this evening, we will have a presentation, and then we will have a Q&A session to follow. If you have questions or comments for our presenter or about the presentation itself, you can use the chat function or the Q&A function in Zoom. Both of those should be enabled, and you should be able to write a question or make a comment there. And we will have time towards the end of the hour to take questions and have a conversation, and we'll curate those from the chat and the Q&A. Okay, now it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Amy Gore. Amy, it's all yours. I'm going to go off camera and let you have it.
Thank you so much to Kevin for the introduction and for the invitation to speak to you all today. It's my privilege to be speaking to such a renowned group of book enthusiasts and bibliophiles and lovers of the printed word. I can't see any of you today, but I'm imagining a warm crowd. So thank you for being here. I'm also privileged to be showcasing on my title slide here and on the cover of my book, the artwork of Nicholas Galanin, who is a Tlingit and Onagax artist. Both images are from his installation, What Have We Become? I want to begin by situating myself in this work. I'm a fifth-generation Italian-American immigrant and an outsider to Indigenous communities. As such, I think a lot about the responsibility of stories. I have responsibilities as a storyteller to tell Indigenous stories respectfully and in the ways that I have been taught by my Native teachers and by Native scholars. I also think about the responsibilities of the listener to stories, and today that's all of you. Toni Morrison teaches us about this responsibility in the way she breaks down the word responsibility. We all have the ability to respond to stories, to make a response as listeners, to take action. So I invite you today not only to listen to these stories about Indigenous books, starting with a land acknowledgement, but to take action by sharing stories with others. And I'll talk a little bit more about how to do that in a minute. So although I am currently zooming in from Nipmuc land in Worcester, Massachusetts, where I am a scholar in residence at the American Antiquarian Society, I'd like to ground my land acknowledgement in the place where I live and work, which is Fargo, North Dakota at North Dakota State University. So I'll read from the screen here our institutional land acknowledgement. We collectively acknowledge that we gather at NDSU, a land-grant institution, on the traditional lands of the Oceti-Sakowin, which is Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota, and Anishinaabe peoples, in addition to many diverse Indigenous peoples still connected to these lands. We honor with gratitude Mother Earth and the Indigenous peoples who have walked with her throughout generations. We will continue to learn how to live in unity with Mother Earth and build strong, mutually beneficial, trusting relationships with Indigenous peoples of our region. So with land acknowledgements, I've been taught by my Indigenous mentors that these land acknowledgements should be both personalized and followed by action. So I am sharing with you today a collective opportunity for action. So in my community in the Fargo-Moorhead area, the Indigenous Association is a nonprofit organization that supports Indigenous peoples living in the area. They are a vital and active force in our community, small but mighty, and they provide educational programming and a gathering space to promote stronger cultural connections. Their organization is currently trying to build a community library in their space with Indigenous authored books for community members to access and enjoy. So with their permission, my colleague Jamie Larson began a book drive on their behalf. Her and I, just this winter, were helping to build some bookshelves for their space. And I'd like to invite you tonight in support of the program and of the association to join me in support by donating a book to the Indigenous Association's community library. There is a QR code on the screen if you're interested. And I think Kevin's going to help me out by putting a link in the chat if that's easier for you. We have queued up a list of Indigenous authored books on Amazon, and I'll also pop this up again at the end of my talk. So thank you for considering that as a way to kind of take action. So I've told you a bit about the Indigenous land that I stand on, my positionality and ways in which to support the Indigenous communities in my area. I'm going to turn now to talk about my book, Book Anatomy, and the full title is Body Politics and the Materiality of Indigenous Book History. This project began when I kept tripping over the phrase book anatomy. Bibliographers seem to use it very casually in labeling the different material pieces of a book. And you can see one example of this labeling on my slide here. This is just a typical, easy to find, Googleable. If you look up book anatomy, this might be something that you find, and you can see all sorts of body language on the screen here when we talk about books. This phrase caught my attention, and I grew curious about the many ways in which we use body language to describe books. We refer to a book's spine and its appendix, a book's face, its header and footer, its body paragraphs, and even an author's body of work or corpus. In fiction, we think about words creating imaginary bodies and about words imaginatively acting upon bodies of the past, present, and future. But here was something much more literal. We hold such an affinity to books that we name their parts as we name them ourselves. So in my book, I used this curious investment between books and bodies to think about the ways in which Indigenous authors negotiated representations of their bodies, and more specifically, their racialized bodies, in the American publishing industry. Representations of bodies figure prominently in Indigenous writing, as Native authors struggle to be perceived within American society as living, modern, embodied intellectuals while using their writing to speak out against injustice. Yet while numerous scholars find the ideas expressed in books to be a source of Indigenous power, I claim books themselves as a source of embodied power. Books contain more than corporeal representations and symbolisms. Whether fiction or nonfiction, books facilitate bodily encounters. As Michelle Copel, Aubrey Jane Hansen, Sarah Henze, and many Native literary scholars continue to attest, quote, stories are inseparable from the sovereignties, bodies, and traditional territories from which they arise, end quote. And as such, books act in relationship with, bear witness to the material worlds in which they circulate. So my project looked to the book itself and its paratextual elements. And by paratext, I mean its graphic design, its illustrations, typefaces, prefaces, appendices, copyright, frontispieces, everything that contextualizes and frames the narrative itself as an embodied expression of print culture power relations. This language of book anatomy reflects a long cultural investment in the link between books and bodies. These bibliographical terms that I mentioned, spine, appendix, header, footnote, they permeate the book with human endowments, but they also reflect the significant social and material reality of books, as made out of the bodies of plants, animals, and sometimes even other humans, as Sarah Key's book, Animal Skins and the Reading Self, published in 2010, Joshua Callahan's The Nature of the Page, published in 2020, and Megan Rosenblum's Dark Archives, a librarian's investigation into the science and history of books bound in human skin, published in 2020, provocatively evaluate. Many have considered the book to extend the life of the human body beyond the grave, and we may even expect books to do what bodies cannot: transcend the invisible forces of time and distance and death. Simultaneously, what Andrew Piper identifies as the tremendous cultural investment in the corporeal identity of the book falls back on the faulty ability to read the human body, which often rested and rests on false assumptions of race and ability. Taken together, the paratextual examination of Indigenous books across editions remains long overdue for its potential to speak to the multifaceted relationships embodied within book history. My project contributes to the scholarly knowledge of Indigenous literary production during the long 19th century, speaks to contemporary debates over the value of print, connects Indigenous literary production to colonization's persecution of bodies, and sets the stage for the later outpouring of Indigenous literature in the late 20th and 21st centuries. So I'm going to ground this theory by giving you one of my quick favorite examples that I talk about in my book, and I actually mentioned in my introduction to set the stage. In the 1930s, a white ethnographer named Frank Linderman became determined to tell a woman's story meaning to record a Native woman's perspective of life on the Great Plains. He built a professional relationship with a Crow, also known as Apsaluka, woman named Pretty Shield, who agreed to tell him her life story. They communicated fluently using Plains Indian Sign Language, while another woman, Goes Together, simultaneously translated Pretty Shield's spoken Crow language into English for Linderman's added benefit. While the ways in which the text became embodied is fascinating, even more fascinating is that once the book was published in 1932, and you can see the book jacket on your right there, one of the opening paratextual pages of the book stresses Pretty Shield's agency over her own body with an inked impression of her thumb, which you see in the middle of your screen here, and the assertive caption, quote, "I told Sign Talker," which is Linderman, "the things that are in this book, and I have signed the paper with my thumb." Pretty Shield's thumbprint marks the text that follows as her own, imprinting her body on the very pages of what could have been an ethnographic exploitation under other circumstances. So she literally puts this book under her thumb, so to speak. Every subsequent reprint and edition of the book, up to the most recent HarperCollins 2021 edition, retains Pretty Shield's thumbprint in the opening paratextual pages of her book. So they honor that mark throughout this book's long history here. So in looking to the paratext, I examine the mutual negotiations, transactions, and perceptions that took place not only in the moment of print, but also in the book's continuing reverberations across time. Books are made and remade with each generation. And as valuable as those first editions are, we seriously undermine the value of books when we prize only the first or only the authoritative edition. Instead, my project seeks to show the value of books across time in a continuation of story only begun by the first edition. So in addition to Pretty Shield, I talk about 4 other Indigenous books and authors from the late 19th to early 20th century, an era that has arguably received less attention in Native literary scholarship than other eras. However, since tonight I have the opportunity to speak to the Book Club of California, I thought I'd share some of my first chapter, which traces the story of what is probably the most valuable and the most plagiarized book in Indigenous literary history, John Rollin Ridge's The Life and Adventures of Joaquín Murieta, first published in 1854 and known today as the first novel published by a Native American and the first novel published in the newly incorporated state of California. So this book is valuable for these first, but it's also additionally valuable because, to my knowledge, only 1 copy of the first edition remains in the world, held at the Beinecke at Yale University. Although I have heard some rumors that there may be potentially 1 more in private collection. So if you know more about that, I'd be interested. So I'll start by giving you some background on the author and move to the plot of the book, and then talk a little bit about the changes that happened to his book in the first few editions. Cherokee writer and expatriate John Rollin Ridge came to California in the heyday of the gold rush. After a brief and unsuccessful stint as a lawyer and on the run from a murder he allegedly committed in Kansas, Ridge followed the streams of migrants heading to the farmlands and gold mining camps of the coastal state. There he attempted to prosper not with a sluice pan or a shovel, but with a pen, publishing poems and articles in local periodicals while picking up work as a newspaper editor. As a man with literary ambitions, Ridge soon turned to the novel and decided to capitalize on the romanticized exploits of the outlaw Joaquín Murieta that had been circulating in regional newspapers. He struck literary gold with his first and only novel, The Life and Adventures of Joaquín Murieta, the celebrated California bandit. So the middle of your screen is a photo of Ridge, and then the image is a copy of that first edition there. The slim pamphlet-sized book, and you might also say unassuming, right? The aesthetic design is very simple, anticipates later dime novels, and claims to recount with historical accuracy the events of Murieta's life, from the bandit's push into a life of crime to his beheading. Ridge's novel inserts readers into the intense violence of mid-19th century California. As the novel opens, the narrative paints a sympathetic portrayal of Murieta, who enthusiastically crosses the border from his boyhood home in Sonora at the conclusion of the US-Mexico War in hopes of becoming an American citizen. He immediately encounters racial prejudice, however, and after a series of brutalities in which Americans rape his mistress, lynch his half-brother, run him off his farm, and whip him, Murieta turns against what's called in the novel his generous and noble nature and into a life of crime. Because of the similar injustices experienced by other Mexicans in California, a number of men began to join Murieta's band and initiate in the novel what in effect becomes an organized crime unit with the sadistic three-fingered Jack as Murieta's right-hand man. The bulk of the novel then relays their daring adventures and close encounters with vigilante law as they exact revenge on the America that denied their equality. The novel ends with Murieta and Jack's dismemberment at the hands of Captain Love and translates the tragedy of Murieta's life into a moral lesson. And this is a quote from the last couple pages of the book. Quote, "There is nothing so dangerous in its consequences as injustice to individuals. Whether it arise from prejudice of color or from any other source, that a wrong done to one man is a wrong to society and to the world." End quote. Murieta leaves the reader entertained by the bandits' daring exploits, but it rewraps the gratuitous sensationalism in the sober message of tragic injustice. As so many others living in 1850s California experienced, however, Ridge did not find the wealth and success of his dreams. Instead, he had his book, his profits, and his copyright stolen from him. In a letter to his relative Stan Watty, Ridge complains of having been swindled from his profits when his publishers sold 7,000 copies of his book, so he claims, but then declared bankruptcy and, quote, "left me along with 100 others to whistle for our money," end quote. 5 years later, Ridge discovers the theft not only of his profits, but also his copyright when a salacious crime magazine, the California Police Gazette, ran his story as a serial in their periodical for 10 consecutive issues from September 3rd to November 5th, 1859, and then published it in a book form that same year, all without his consent or byline. So you'll see on the screen, that's an image of the book form of the plagiarism by the Gazette. And I wanted to show the similarities between the two texts as clearly a plagiarism of Ridge's early edition. I think most likely the person plagiarizing had a copy of Ridge's text in their hand. So you can read that for yourself. So although some of the Gazette's changes do polish Ridge's prose and add further details to Murieta's life, they nevertheless work to disguise the theft of Ridge's literary labor. They also undermine the original narrative's call for racial justice, most notably in the changes made to the ending. As Joe Goki documents, the Gazette radically alters Ridge's ending lament of injustice for people of color by cutting out two of the original text's most often quoted passages. So the one I just read regarding injustice to individuals, and the final line, quote, "Alas, how happy might Rosita have been had man never learned to wrong his fellow man," end quote. The Gazette ends instead with an assertion of Americans and implicitly white American women as the victims of Murieta, with no mention of the wrongs done to anyone else. Instead, in the plagiarism, the last sentence reads, quote, "But little doubt exists in the writer's mind that many persons who are mentioned in the advertisements headed information wanted and emanating perhaps from a mother inquiring for her son or a wife for her husband have been the victims of the bandit Joaquín," end quote. Not only do the textual changes, therefore, sever Ridge from his text, but they also sever what Irwin identifies as Ridge's attempt to put American racism at the root of violence. In addition to erasing Ridge's byline and copyright from the opening pages, another change the Gazette makes is to cut out the first edition's two prefaces that identify Ridge and his identity and his intentions for the text, while also replacing the original Anthony and Baker lithographs with several illustrations by a Charles Christian Null, a well-established artist whose work embellished many San Francisco periodicals during the 1850s. The Null illustrations would later predominate nearly all major reprints of Ridge's Murieta, appearing in both plagiarisms and bylined editions from the 19th century to the most recent 21st century Penguin reprint. Even as these modern editions restore Ridge's byline to his literary work, the Null illustrations, as a symbol of the Gazette plagiarism, continue to haunt the book to the present day. So here's an array of just some of the editions, and all of these feature the Null illustrations, so you can see how they continue to haunt the text, even as Ridge is getting his byline back on the book. No known records exist of any attempt by Ridge to pursue legal action against the Gazette, but neither did he give up his claims to his book. Although his unexpected death in October 1867 cut short any legal action he might have taken, the second edition of his book includes an enraged author's preface that calls out the unjust plagiarism of his book and claims this 1871 edition as, quote, "a matter of justice, both to the author and the public, inasmuch as a spurious edition has been foisted upon unsuspecting publishers and by them circulated to the infringement of the author's copyright and the damage of his literary credit," end quote. Sadly, however, Ridge's attempts at justice were largely ignored in the course of history. He never received restitution for the copyright theft, and instead, the Gazette plagiarism became the most popular source for the Murieta story. In fact, Murieta has become one of the most internationally appropriated single narratives in literary history, I would argue, translated into multiple languages and genres, which today include novels, films, plays, songs, an epic poem, children's books, a Soviet rock opera, yes, a Soviet rock opera, and the inspiration for both Batman and Zorro. The number of versions and editions through the 20th century remain uncounted, but certainly range in the hundreds, all printed without profit to Ridge or his descendants. And while Ridge's original narrative has now lived in public domain for well over 100 years, its original theft remains problematic for contemporary editions, translations, and adaptations that perpetuate the plagiarism without acknowledging its problematic history or crediting Ridge. So what I'm doing in this chapter is tracing not only the roller coaster of a book history for the first Native novel, but I also parallel Ridge's loss of legal copyright with the loss of property rights for Indigenous peoples during the 19th century and beyond, as well as Mexican-American citizens in California in the aftermath of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Multiple scholars cite that the model for copyright is real property, and in this context, the foul play towards Ridge's copyright stands as especially egregious. In Isabel Hoffmeyer's words, quote, "One route into being a rights-bearing subject was to become a book-bearing one," end quote. And for Ridge to write and attempt to publish a book under his own copyright made a provocative statement in the midst of the overwhelming dispossession of his era and in the continued disenfranchisement of Native peoples as citizens, subjects, and fully realized human beings. Yet Ridge's property rights were ignored, while others profited off of his written version of the Murieta story. Secondly, in this chapter, I'm also talking about what I call editorial dismemberments. So I'm going to talk about this this imitation of a poster with unknown origins that was included in the 1932 Grabhorn Press reproduction. And so this is a little bit of the story of what we think we know about the historical figure of Joaquín. In August of 1853, a poster appeared in Stockton, California, to advertise the town's newest local entertainment. For one day only, as the poster announces, one can be gruesomely titillated by the dismembered body parts of two infamous California bandits. Joaquín Murieta's head and three-fingered Jack's hand, preserved in large jars, had not been easily obtained and pointed to the continuing violence within the newly formed state of California. In previous years, following the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, newspapers began to announce the continual raids and murders committed against local citizenry and blamed a man named Joaquín as the ringleader. Yet the newspapers could not agree. At times, Joaquín had as many as 5 different last names, perhaps representing 5 different men, and he seemed able to commit crimes simultaneously in widespread geographical locations. The crimes for which Joaquín was accused became so troublesome that on May 11th, 1853, the California legislature authorized Captain Harry Love and his group of rangers to capture the elusive Joaquín. After 2 months of searching, Love and his men triumphantly brought a dismembered head and hand that they claimed belonged to the one and only Joaquín and his lieutenant, Three-Fingered Jack, to the governor in exchange for a substantial monetary award. The controversially identified body parts then made their way around the state in an attempt to convince California citizens of the re-establishment of law and order. At the conclusion of Ridge's novel, the narrative follows Murieta's head past its decapitation to its exhibition across the state of California. It reports the surprise of superstitious onlookers who, quote, were seized with a kind of terror to observe that the mustache of the fearful robber had grown longer since his head was cut off, and that the nails of Three-Fingered Jack's hand had lengthened almost an inch, end quote. Three-fingered Jack's hand also invoked in the morbid sightseers, quote, a strange haunting dread over the mind, as if it had been a conscious, voluntary agent of evil, end quote. In his reading, David Drysdale invokes the novel itself as another type of decapitated exhibit, one through which Americans can similarly read the history of California conquest and participate in the circulation of the outlaw's head. His words match Meredith McGill's description of reprinting books as a process by which, quote, authors are detached and reattached to their texts, end quote. Their words provoke a sobering reflection on the production of editions as not only the rebirth of the book's body, but also potentially a disfigurement or even decapitation of a previous bookish corpus. I'll conclude with this. In the unfinished book, Alexandra Gillespie writes, quote, books like decapitated heads are uncanny objects. They signify in the absence of their author's capacity to speak, end quote. The book history of Ridge's Murieta troubles our assumptions of new editions, even scholarly editions, as primarily in service of the text and its author. Like the continued growth of hair on Murieta's severed head, the unsettling bibliographical body lives on after its dismemberment as both a continuing presence that destabilizes the state's narrative of closure and as a haunting testament to the racialized inheritance of book history. The bibliographical bodies of Indigenous book history continue to gesture towards the expansive dispossession that extends from property rights to copyright for Indigenous people, while simultaneously refusing to accept their bibliographical severance by growing, reanimating, and unsettling. Every reading of the text, every reprint and new edition participates in the reattachment and decapitation of Murieta's head, exhibiting the ongoing tension between the membership and dismemberment in this country. So thank you very much. I'm going to end by putting that QR code back up. There is a discount that UMass is offering for my book if you're so interested. And I just want to mention that all royalties from my book will be donated to the Indian Land Tenure Foundation. So I'm happy to answer questions and thanks very much.
Okay, I'm back. My sound wasn't on. And now is the time for everyone out there, if you have questions or comments for our speaker, to use the chat and the Q&A to do that. I'll give you a moment to, we'll keep this on the screen for a minute before we bring your tile up big so we can see you as we have our conversation. People might want to get down the information about buying the book. I did put in the chat other ways to buy the book. I didn't put the code in the chat, so you can get that off of the screen now, UMass 20, and buying it from the publisher. And as you guys do that, I'm going to just say a couple words. I'm going to thank you for this terrific presentation. We'll say that I really do appreciate at the very beginning the frame that you gave us of responsibility. And of course, I love a really good land acknowledgement that is grounded in the idea of what you can do, right? Like what to do next, like taking action, and the whole idea of sharing stories, and especially the stories that you shared with us about the book history of Joaquín Murieta's copyright thievery, right? The Gazette plagiarism and all that stuff. That's just crazy. I don't think I knew any of that before tonight. So I do appreciate you sharing that. Let's look here at the chat and the Q&A. Oh, this is so funny. The first question that I'm seeing is one that I was wondering, and I have on my list here, is like, what drives you to work on this kind of research and this kind of work? How did this come to you, and what does it mean to you to be working in this field?
Oh gosh, thanks. That's a great question. I originally intended to follow a different line of pursuit. I was originally very interested in the Indigenous Gothic, and I was trying to think about that and theorize that. So you can see some of that kind of come out in like the decapitated heads and kind of the um, gruesomeness of some of these stories that, is very present when talking about, kind of the history of this land and the violence. But I attended a class by Dr. Jesse Aleman, and he also studies 19th century literary history, book history, and he made this mention in class about the ways in which books move, the ways in which books would be left on the train and picked back up by the next passenger, and the ways in which kind of books have this active role in society. And so that just really got me hooked. I had another class that sort of introduced me to how to work with the archives, and here I am, almost a decade later, writing about Indigenous book history. And I was specifically interested in applying book history to Indigenous literary history because some of the most common questions that I get when people ask me what I do, they ask, well, do you read books in Indigenous languages? And I was like, well, actually, there are a ton of books written in English. And they're like, well, okay, but after 1970, right? And I was like, no, actually, the first book written by a Native author that we know of was published in English in 1772. And there's this long book history that I think wasn't getting very much attention. And I wanted to be able to talk about that and spread the word, and especially with the precarity, I think, of print and the value of print in our culture, to be able to not only talk about Indigenous book history, but to follow it through to the present day and what value all those different editions and reprints and even those like crumbly wood pulp copies have to us in our present day. So you right away hit on a question that I started getting a little bit rambly about, but
No,
I
that's
appreciate
great. Yeah, you clearly are passionate about this work and this stuff. So I think people wanted to know how that happened, how that came about. I'm going to stop the share so people can see us. Everybody has had your last chance to take any of this off the screen. I'm stopping the share, and maybe I can't stop your share.
I can be able to do it.
Yeah.
Okay.
It wanted me to share something to stop you share, and I don't want to share anything. I wanted to see you.
Okay.
Yeah, you know what I loved early on, you said something about books extending life beyond the grave. And that really kind of stood out to me. I wrote that down because along the lines of people leaving a book on a train, right? And then somebody else picks up that book and it has a whole journey and a whole life and the history of that book, as opposed, in addition to other definitions, I guess, of book history, just makes my mind, explode, I guess, and thinking about all. Yeah, it's so crazy. But I love it. And I really did like the beginning part about giving that groundwork on the human endowments, right, that are in a book and how that came to be and why we call these parts of a book what we do, and how that is an extension of humanity in some way. Oh, it's a great idea for you to also contact your local public library to get your book. Usually don't put that in the chat about how to get the book, but you can have your local library get it as well. Carol asked an interesting question, because I thought of this too. Was Ridge the only victim, right, of the publisher who absconded, sold 7,000 copies and then just disappeared and never paid him? And I'm sure this kind of thing happens a lot. And is it really happening to mostly Indigenous people, writers, as opposed to white male writers? Did the publisher also screw them over? Or is it really just this one marginalized population?
Yeah, good question. I did not pursue the records of W.B. Cook, who was the publisher and printer for the book. Rich does mention others who were also left whistling for their money. And I did look into, Bancroft mentions in the publishing history of San Francisco how unstable the publishing industry was in the 1850s, mid-century, and how many kind of boom and bust, print shops and publishers were happening at the time. I did sort of a dive into the San Francisco business directories for the time. It does look like potentially Cook declared bankruptcy and then opened up a similarly named business down the street. So I think there is potentially, some Wild West dealings with not only kind of gold and land speculation, but with publishing houses as well. So I can't confirm for sure. And my focus wasn't on Cook and kind of looking at these other sources. As far as Indigenous authors and copyright, though, there were earlier authors who had filed for copyright and did receive profits and acknowledgments of their text. So I don't think that I could claim that this is a wide, the theft of copyright was widespread. I will say, though, with Pretty Shield, she did not claim copyright for her text. It was Linderman. And so the white ethnographer claimed copyright for the text and did not list her as a co-author or as a co-copyright holder. And so there is a history of acknowledgement that is also problematic, even if there's not sort of outright theft.
Yeah, that's interesting. And do you know if she was upset about that? Like, did she want to be a co-author, co-writer, co-copyright, or it wasn't even a thing, right? He just did it, and
yeah, there's no record that I can see of Pretty Shield's feelings about that, or Linderman's. It was common practice for the white ethnographer to just claim sole copyright. But I do think Linderman was potentially more ethical in the way that he went about the text. He puts her words in direct quotations. He seems like did not have a heavy editorial hand and, kind of rearranging things, putting them in chronological order. He seemed to do his best to represent her words faithfully. And they did have an ongoing relationship. It wasn't just a ethnographer, anthropologist going out for one summer and writing down a story and never having contact with that person again. One of the really heartwarming things, and positive things that I discovered from tracing Pretty Shield through contemporary editions is that the two families had an ongoing connection to the point where descendants of both of them are co-writing the new preface for the newer editions. So that's really beautiful. One of the prefaces writes about kind of a family reunion where Linderman and Pretty Shield's descendants gather together. So I think that's one of the more beautiful examples of what happens when you trace a text through to a contemporary moment.
Yeah, and you said that Ridge didn't pursue legal action on any of these times that his copyright was usurped, or do you know why that is? What or what that would be? Like why? Why wouldn't he?
There's no records. I mean, some of the fires and earthquakes that California have made like documentation difficult to find for some things. But Ridge also died rather suddenly. And so that may have also been why he didn't kind of pursue. His wife did survive him and publish some of his poems posthumously, and potentially an edition of Murieta, although we're not sure her hand in that or whether sort of an editorial, an editor sort of took over and was like, well, he's dead now, I'll publish a new edition. We're not quite sure that relationship. But I think mostly, it's because he passed away suddenly.
Yeah, we're getting close to the top of the hour. So if somebody has questions or comments that they haven't put in the chat or the Q&A yet, now is the time to do it. There is a question about other editions and studies of Ridge and using his name's Yellowbird versus his John Rollin Ridge name. And do you know why that was, or why some people choose to use one over the other or one without the other? Because I even noticed some of them didn't say Yellowbird at all, and some of the covers did.
Yeah, that's a good pickup. Sometimes the byline is Yellowbird, sometimes it's Ridge. The copyright actually was registered as Bridge. It was misspelled. And so I do speculate in my book about why the switch. Potentially, it's the marketability of a name like Yellowbird rather than Ridge, sort of this a kind of exotic name that that Ridge might have felt pressured to use in the publishing industry to try to market his books in a certain way. Other times, Ridge, maybe because he had a complicated relationship with his nation. Once he left Cherokee Nation, he never stepped foot in the boundaries of his nation again. So he had, that's kind of a long story, but he did have a complicated relationship with his nation. So that might also be a reason.
Interesting. There's an interesting question. I don't know how much you know about Rollin Ridge and his whole life story and all of that stuff, but there's a comment in the Q&A about someone read that he owns slaves, and did he side with the Confederates, and why? His parents seem to have wanted him to avoid the whites and not marry them, yet he embraced white culture. All super interesting things in this comment. Well, what made him want to write a book about Indigenous people if he was betrayed by the whites that he embraced? Like, what's going on there?
Yeah, there's a great biography. That's actually where the picture of Ridge that I put on my screen on my PowerPoint, that's from still a very good biography of Ridge. So for anyone interested, there's some great resources out there on Ridge's life. It is very complicated. It seems very likely that he did commit that murder, and that's one of the reasons that he never went back to Cherokee Nation again, because he would have been prosecuted for that murder and potentially jailed. So he avoided going home. I think that he clearly had an interest in a literary life, being an editor, writing poems, writing this novel. And yeah, there is a complicated relationship with the Confederacy there, but I'll leave that for the biography.
Yeah, I didn't think you went big into that in your book, but people should buy the book. It is in the chat. If you didn't catch it out of the chat, you can always email me. I'm kevin@bccbooks.org. I'll send you all the links to buy the book, also with the code for the discount. I am going to put, as we get close to wrapping up here, I'm going to put the book drive link in the chat again, because I know people definitely joined us after I first posted it. So if you're interested in checking out the book drive that Amy talked about, click on that link and it shows you all the books that are available out there. Amy, did you want to say anything in closing before we wrap up and I send everyone on their way? We're at the top of the hour, so now is the time to do it if you wanted to make any last comments.
No, it's my pleasure to speak with you all. It was a pleasure to be invited, and thank you for taking the time out of your Monday evening to join a Zoom for an hour, and it was my pleasure to talk with you.
And I'm going to send you the recording of this. I'll send you the chat and the Q&A comments after, so you can kind of look at them. If there's anything in there that we didn't really talk about that you wanted to answer, you could answer me, or I could give you the contact information for some of the participants if you wanted to get back to them as well. But I will follow up with that, and I will close now by thanking you for this great presentation. I have the book, but as many people know, the book club is moving our club rooms, so it's in one of the many boxes here in my new office, and I haven't had a chance to get through it yet. But I am going to go check it out, and I hope everyone out there who is interested in this topic also gets the book as well. So thank you, Amy. This was terrific. I really appreciate it, your time. And thank you, everyone, for attending this Book Club of California program this evening. Join us for our next virtual program on Monday, July 1st. So you've got 2 weeks off, 2 weeks off there. It is titled The New Suburbia, How Diversity Remade Suburban Life in Los Angeles After 1945. A little California history there for you. Our speaker will be author and historian Becky Nicolaitis. You can register for that event online at bccbooks.org/programs or using the link in any of the weekly program emails that you might be getting from the book club. So again, thanks everyone for joining us. I hope you have a wonderful evening. Be well and take care of yourself. Hope to see you soon. Thank you. And thanks, Amy. This was terrific. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Okay. Good night, everyone.